At my husband's burial, while I stood there in black, accepting condolences from 200 people who called him a good man, his boss leaned in close and whispered 5 words that would destroy everything I thought I knew. There's something he hid from you. My name is Celeste Andrade. I was a tax attorney in Manhattan, married for 7 years to a man I thought I understood completely. We had a house in Westchester, 2 cars, and plans for the future. We'd talked about starting a family next year. I was happy. At least, I believed I was. Brian died on a rainy Tuesday in March. His car flipped on Route 78, coming back from what he called a supplier meeting in Pennsylvania. The police said he lost control on a curve. Instant death. I was in court when I got the call. The funeral was at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Colleagues, college friends, neighbors, they all showed up. Over 200 people telling me what a wonderful man he was. Generous, honest, a man of integrity. I stood there accepting their embraces. Too numb to cry, too shocked to feel anything at all. That's when Neil Ashford approached me. Gray hair, impeccable suit, the kind of composed expression that comes from years of running a company. He was the CEO where Brian had worked for 12 years. He took my hand, looked me in the eyes, and spoke so quietly that no one else could hear. He told me Brian had hidden something, that I deserved to know the truth, that I should call him the next day. I couldn't wait. I called him that same night, still wearing my funeral dress, standing alone in my kitchen, and what he told me made my legs give out. I sat on the cold tile floor, phone pressed to my ear, and felt the ground crack open beneath everything I thought my life was built on. This is the story of what I discovered. The lies, the betrayal, the secrets my husband took to his grave, and the ones that didn't stay buried. It's a long story, and I need someone to hear it through to the end. If you want to know what Neil told me that night, and what I found when I started digging, make sure you're following along. You won't want to miss what comes next. I called Neil Ashford at 11 o'clock that night, still in my black dress, standing in the middle of my kitchen. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting. "Celeste," he said, "I'm sorry to do this to you today of all days. But you need to know before anyone else tells you." I asked him what he meant. What could possibly be so urgent that he'd approach me at my husband's funeral? There was a pause. Then he said it. Brian was under internal investigation for the past 8 months. He embezzled nearly $2 million from the company. I felt the room tilt. My vision went dark at the edges. I grabbed the counter to keep myself upright. That was impossible. We didn't have that kind of money. Our house was nice, sure, but it wasn't a mansion. Our cars were practical. We budgeted, we saved. I would have noticed $2 million. I told Neil he had to be wrong, that there must be some mistake. "The money wasn't with you," he said. "It was in an account in Delaware, under someone else's name." My mouth went dry. He gave me the name. Renata Vidal. I'd never heard it before in my life. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my laptop in Brian's home office, searching. It didn't take long to find her. Renata Vidal, 31 years old, interior designer based in Hoboken. Her Instagram was public and full of photos from places I'd never been. Paris, the Maldives, Tokyo. In the captions, she thanked the love of my life for making her dreams come true. I clicked through the dates. Every single trip matched one of Brian's business trips. The ones where he said he was meeting suppliers, visiting warehouses, closing deals. My stomach turned. I ran to the bathroom and threw up, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I went back to the laptop and kept digging. I found her address in Hoboken through a public records search. A luxury apartment building with a view of the Hudson River. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. I drove to Hoboken that morning, parked outside her building, sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to breathe, trying to convince myself that maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe she was a cousin, a business partner. Maybe there was an explanation that didn't end with my entire marriage being a lie. I walked into the building, took the elevator to the 7th floor, stood outside apartment 7E, and I knocked. The door opened. She was beautiful. Dark hair, red lipstick, designer clothes. She looked at me like she'd been expecting this moment for a long time. But that's not what made my heart stop. It was the baby in her arms. A little girl, maybe 8 months old. Chubby cheeks, brown eyes, and a dimple on her chin. Brian's dimple, the one I used to trace with my finger when he smiled. Renata looked at me and said, without a hint of surprise, that she knew who I was. That Brian had told her he was going to ask me for a divorce next month. That he was finally going to choose her. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at that baby's face, seeing my husband in every feature. 7 years. 7 years of marriage, and he had built an entire other life without me knowing. A woman, a child, a future that didn't include me at all. I don't remember walking back to my car. I don't remember the drive home. I just remember sitting in my driveway, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel, and realizing that the man I'd buried yesterday was a stranger. And the worst part, I was starting to think his death wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was that I'd ever believed him at all. I spent 3 days in bed after that visit to Hoboken, curtains drawn, phone off. I told everyone I needed space to grieve, but grief wasn't what kept me there. It was the weight of realizing I'd been living inside a lie so complete that I couldn't trust a single memory. Every romantic dinner, every weekend trip, every time Brian said he loved me, I replayed it all, searching for cracks, for signs I should have seen. But he'd been flawless, the perfect husband, the perfect liar. On the 4th day, I got out of bed. Not because I felt better, because I felt something else, something cold and sharp growing in my chest. I needed to know everything. I started in his home office. Brian had always been protective of that room. He said it was because of confidential work documents. I'd respected that boundary for 7 years. Now I tore through every drawer, every folder, every file. It didn't take long to find what he'd hidden. Behind a row of old tax returns, there was a manila envelope I'd never seen before. Inside, I found the deed to Renata's apartment. His name was on it. He'd bought it for her 3 years ago, right around the time he told me we should wait another year before trying for a baby. Right around the time he said we needed to be more careful with money. My hands trembled as I kept digging. I found bank statements from the Delaware account Neil had mentioned. $2 million transferred in small amounts over 4 years, all of it going to Renata. Shopping, travel, the apartment's mortgage, a car. She'd been living like a princess on money he stole from his company. Money that should have been building our future. But the document that broke me was at the bottom of the pile. A life insurance policy I'd never known existed. $1 million. And the beneficiary wasn't me. It was Renata Vidal. I sat on the floor of that office, papers scattered around me, and let the full picture come into focus. Brian hadn't just been cheating. He'd been planning. If he died, Renata would get $1 million. I would get nothing. He'd set it up so that even in death, I'd be erased. For a moment, the pain was so intense I couldn't move. 7 years of marriage, and I was never part of his real plan. I was the cover story. The respectable wife who made him look good. The woman who waited at home while he built a life with someone else. I thought about Renata's Instagram, all those pictures of paradise, the gratitude to the love of her life. She'd been thanking my husband for trips paid with stolen money while I budgeted for groceries. And the baby, that little girl with Brian's dimple. She existed because he'd decided his future was with Renata, not with me. Every time he told me we should wait, that the timing wasn't right for children, he already had a daughter. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn every photo, every memory, every trace of him in this house. But then I stopped. I looked at the papers around me, the deed, the bank statements, the insurance policy. This wasn't just evidence of betrayal. This was evidence of fraud, financial crimes, exposed vulnerabilities in a scheme that Renata probably thought was airtight. I was a tax attorney. I'd spent my career studying how people hide money and how the law catches them. Brian might have thought I was just his clueless wife, the woman who never asked too many questions. But he'd underestimated me. Grief wouldn't get me answers. Anger wouldn't get me justice. But the law would. I gathered every document and made copies. I took photos of everything. I created a file and labeled it with the date. Then I picked up my phone and searched for the best fraud attorney in New York. I found her, Diane Foster, specialized in asset recovery and marital fraud, a reputation for being ruthless. Exactly what I needed. I called her office and scheduled an appointment for the next morning. Brian thought he'd buried his secrets with him. He thought death would protect his lies. He was wrong. I was going to dig up every single one. Diane Foster's office was on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown. Glass walls, leather chairs, a view of the city that made you feel like you were looking down on everyone's secrets. She was exactly what I expected. Sharp eyes, tailored suit, the kind of calm that comes from having seen the worst of what people do to each other. I laid everything out on her conference table. The deed, the bank statements, the insurance policy, the photos from Renata's Instagram with dates that matched Brian's business trips. Diane studied each document without a word, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, she told me I had a strong case. Brian had committed fraud against his employer and against me. The money in Delaware was traceable, the apartment was an asset purchased with stolen funds, and the life insurance policy was clear evidence of intent to defraud me of marital assets. But then, she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me that Renata would probably claim ignorance, that she'd say she had no idea where the money came from, that Brian told her it was legitimate income, bonuses, investments. It was a common defense, and sometimes it worked. I thought about Renata opening that door, holding that baby, telling me Brian was going to leave me for her. She hadn't seemed surprised. She hadn't seemed guilty. She'd seemed like a woman who believed she'd already won. Maybe she really didn't know the money was stolen, or maybe she knew exactly what Brian was doing and didn't care as long as the lifestyle kept coming. Either way, I needed more. Diane suggested I go through Brian's personal devices. His laptop, his phone, if I could find it. She said people always leave digital trails, especially when they think they're being careful. Overconfidence makes them sloppy. The phone had been destroyed in the accident, but the laptop was still in his office at home. I'd looked through folders, but I hadn't checked his email. I hadn't gone through his cloud storage. I'd been so focused on the paper trail that I'd missed the obvious. That night, I sat down with his laptop and started the real excavation. His email password was saved in the browser. He'd never expected me to look. I opened his inbox and found years of messages, work correspondence, newsletters, receipts. But there was another folder, one labeled with a single letter. R. Inside were hundreds of emails between Brian and Renata. 4 years of messages. I read through them with my chest tight, forcing myself to keep going even when the words made me want to throw the laptop across the room. They'd met at a design conference in Newark. She'd been hired to decorate the company's new office space. Within 2 months, they were together. He told her I was cold, distant, that our marriage was over in everything but name. He said he stayed with me for appearances, that divorce would hurt his career. He'd rewritten our entire relationship to make himself the victim. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Buried in the messages from the previous year, I found a conversation about the insurance policy. Renata had asked why he was putting her as beneficiary instead of me. Brian explained that it was part of the plan, that once everything was finalized, they'd have enough money to start fresh. He told her not to worry, that he had it all figured out. She'd thanked him. She'd told him she trusted him completely. Maybe she really believed the money was clean, but she knew about the insurance policy. She knew she was going to benefit from his death. She knew I was being cut out, and she didn't question it. That wasn't ignorance. That was complicity. I saved every email, screenshot after screenshot. I organized them by date, by topic, by relevance to the fraud. And then I found something else. A draft message that Brian never sent. Written 3 days before he died. It was addressed to Renata. In it, he told her that Neil was getting suspicious, that the internal investigation was getting too close. He said he needed to move some of the money out of the Delaware account before the company's auditors found it. He mentioned a second account, one he hadn't told anyone about. Not even her. He never finished the message, never sent it. 3 days later, he was dead. But that draft told me something crucial. There was more money, another account, and if Brian had been scared enough to move funds, maybe he'd already done it before the accident. I called Diane first thing in the morning and told her what I'd found. The emails proving Renata's knowledge of the insurance fraud, and the mention of a second account. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she told me this changed everything. She said if we could find that second account, we wouldn't just have a case against Renata, we'd have leverage over her. Proof that Brian hid assets even from his own mistress. Renata thought she knew all of Brian's secrets, but he'd been lying to her too. Diane moved fast. Within a week, She had a forensic accountant tracing Brian's financial footprint. Every transfer, every shell company, every account that touched the Delaware funds. His digital trail was messier than he'd thought. Arrogance had made him careless. The second account existed. It was in the Cayman Islands, opened 18 months before Brian died. There was almost $400,000 in it. And unlike the Delaware account, this one was in Brian's name alone. Renata wasn't on it. She had no idea it existed. When Diane told me, I felt something shift inside me. Not satisfaction exactly, something colder. Brian had been stealing from everyone, his company, me, and even the woman he claimed to love. He'd built a safety net for himself and only himself. If things went wrong with Renata, if Neil's investigation got too close, he had an exit. He could disappear and start over, leaving all of us behind. That's who he really was. Not a man torn between two women. Not a flawed husband who made mistakes. He was a con artist who saw every person in his life as a resource to be used and discarded. But understanding what he did wasn't enough. I needed to understand why. I went back to the emails, read them again more carefully this time. I wasn't looking for evidence of the affair anymore. I was looking for the origin, the moment Brian decided to become someone else. I found it buried in messages from 5 years ago. Brian had applied for a promotion, Senior Vice President of Finance. He told me about it at the time, said it was practically guaranteed, that Neil had all but promised him the position. I remembered how excited he'd been, how we'd celebrated with dinner at our favorite restaurant in the city. But in the emails, I saw the truth. Brian didn't get the promotion. The board chose someone else, a younger executive brought in from outside the company. Neil's message to Brian was apologetic but firm. He said Brian was valuable, respected, essential to the team, but the board wanted fresh perspective at the senior level. Brian's response was professional, grateful even. He thanked Neil for the opportunity and said he understood. But 2 weeks later, the first transfer to Delaware appeared. He'd started stealing almost immediately after being passed over. The affair with Renata began a few months later. Everything. The money, the secret apartment, the other woman, the baby. It all started because Brian didn't get a promotion. I sat with that realization for a long time. 7 years of marriage. All the plans we'd made, the life I thought we were building, he'd thrown it all away because his ego couldn't handle being told no. He didn't betray me because he fell in love with someone else. He betrayed me because he felt entitled to more than he had. And he decided to take it. I wasn't the cause of his choices. I wasn't even a factor. I was just collateral damage in a tantrum that lasted 4 years. That truth should have made me angrier. Instead, it made me calm, cold, focused. Brian had destroyed our marriage over a bruised ego. Now I was going to destroy everything he'd built with Renata using the law he thought he was smart enough to outrun. I called Diane and told her I wanted to move forward with everything. The civil suit against Renata for receiving stolen funds, the claim against the life insurance policy, the motion to freeze the Cayman account, all of it. Diane said she'd already started the paperwork. But she warned me that Renata would fight back, that she'd hire her own lawyers and try to paint herself as a victim, a single mother deceived by a manipulative man. It might get ugly, public, painful. I told her I didn't care. Brian had spent 4 years building a fantasy for Renata. Designer clothes, luxury travel, a beautiful apartment with a view of the river. She'd lived like royalty while I clipped coupons and postponed having children because my husband said we couldn't afford it yet. Every sunset she watched from that apartment was paid for with money that should have been mine. I wanted it back, all of it. But more than that, I wanted her to know that the fairy tale was over, that the man she'd trusted had lied to her too, that the life she thought she'd secured was built on sand, and I was the tide coming in. Diane filed the first motion on a Friday afternoon. By Monday, Renata's accounts were frozen. The game had officially begun. Renata hired a lawyer within 48 hours of her accounts being frozen. His name was Victor Crane, a defense attorney known for representing wealthy clients in fraud cases. He was expensive, aggressive, and very good at making victims look like villains. Diane warned me that Crane would try to shift the narrative. He'd paint Renata as a single mother blindsided by a man's lies. He'd argue that she had no knowledge of the fraud, that she was just as much a victim as I was. Maybe more, because she'd been left alone with a child and no support. I told Diane I had the emails. Renata knew about the insurance policy. She knew Brian was hiding assets from me. Diane said emails could be interpreted different ways. A good lawyer could argue that Renata was naive, not complicit, that she trusted Brian without understanding the details. Crane would make her sympathetic. He'd make me look vindictive. I needed something stronger, something that couldn't be spun. That's when I thought of Neil Ashford. Neil had started the internal investigation. He'd seen Brian's financial records from the company side. He knew exactly how the money was moved, how Brian had falsified invoices and created fake vendor accounts to funnel cash out of the business. If Neil testified about the sophistication of the scheme, it would be harder for Crane to argue that Renata was an innocent bystander. Brian wasn't a man who made impulsive mistakes. He was a calculated thief, and Renata had benefited too directly, too consistently to claim she never noticed. I called Neil and asked if we could meet. He agreed immediately. We sat in a coffee shop in Newark, near the company's headquarters. Neil looked tired. He told me the investigation had taken a toll on everyone, the board, the employees, him personally. Brian had been with the company for 12 years. Neil had mentored him, trusted him, defended him when others raised concerns. Finding out the truth had shaken him deeply. I asked what kind of concerns others had raised. Neil hesitated, then told me. A few employees had noticed inconsistencies over the years, vendors who couldn't be verified, expense reports that didn't match receipts, but Brian always had explanations. He was charming, confident, meticulous. He made people feel stupid for questioning him. I recognized that description. Brian had done the same thing to me. Neil said he'd cooperate with my case fully. He'd provide documents, testimony, whatever Diane needed. He wanted to see justice done, for the company and for me. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. He said that in the final weeks of the investigation, before Brian died, Brian had made a mistake. He'd gotten sloppy. He'd used his company email to send a wire transfer confirmation to his personal account. It was the thread that unraveled everything. The auditors traced it back to Delaware, and from there to the apartment, the car, the travel. But there was one more thing. That wire transfer confirmation had been CC'd to someone. An address Neil didn't recognize at first, but when he looked into it, he found that the email belonged to a financial advisor in Hoboken, the same financial advisor Renata used for her personal investments. Neil gave me the name, David Kerr. Renata hadn't just received the money. She had a financial advisor managing it, someone who helped her invest funds that came from falsified invoices and stolen corporate accounts. Either Kerr didn't ask questions about where the money came from, or he knew and didn't care. Either way, Renata's claim of ignorance was getting harder to believe. I took the information to Diane that same afternoon. She said this was exactly what we needed. If Kerr had documentation showing regular deposits from Brian's accounts, it proved a pattern. It showed that Renata wasn't just accepting occasional gifts from a generous boyfriend. She was systematically receiving and investing stolen money over a period of years. Diane subpoenaed Kerr's records the next day. While we waited for the response, I started preparing for the confrontation. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. Diane said it would likely be settled before then. Crane would see the evidence mounting and push Renata to negotiate, but I wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. I wanted the truth on record. I wanted Renata to sit in that courtroom and hear exactly what Brian had done, and exactly how she'd benefited from it. I thought about what Diane had said early on, that Renata would fight back, that it might get ugly. Good. Let it get ugly. I'd spent 7 years being the understanding wife, the patient partner, the woman who didn't ask too many questions because she trusted her husband completely. That woman was gone. I was done being polite. The morning Kerr's financial records arrived at Diane's office, she called me with 2 words. We had her. The documents showed 18 months of deposits from Brian's accounts into Renata's investment portfolio. Regular transfers, carefully timed to avoid detection. And in the notes section of one deposit, a single line that Kerr had apparently copied from Brian's instructions. For ours future, keep separate from main account. Renata knew the money was being hidden. She knew it was meant to be kept secret. Her ignorance defense was dead. The court date was 3 weeks away. I was ready. The courthouse was in Lower Manhattan. Gray stone, tall columns, the kind of building designed to make you feel small. I arrived an hour early, wearing a black suit I'd bought specifically for this day. Diane met me on the steps with a leather briefcase full of documents, 4 years of Brian's lies, organized and indexed, ready to be entered into the record. Renata was already inside when we walked in. She sat at the defendant's table with Victor Crane beside her, dressed in a soft blue dress that made her look delicate, vulnerable. She'd styled her hair differently than in her Instagram photos. Less glamorous, more maternal. Crane had clearly coached her on the image she needed to project. She didn't look at me. Not once. The judge called the proceedings to order, and Diane began. She started with the timeline. Brian's failed promotion 5 years ago. The first transfer to Delaware 2 weeks later. The pattern of falsified invoices and phantom vendors that funneled money out of the company and into accounts Renata controlled. Diane presented each piece of evidence methodically. Bank statements, wire transfers, the deed to the Hoboken apartment, the life insurance policy naming Renata as sole beneficiary. Then she introduced the emails. Diane read excerpts aloud, Brian explaining the insurance policy to Renata, Renata thanking him, telling him she trusted him completely. Brian warning her not to ask too many questions about where the money came from. Renata agreeing without hesitation. I watched the judge's face as Diane read. His expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. Then came the records from David Kerr. 18 months of deposits into Renata's investment portfolio. The note Brian had included with one transfer, instructing Kerr to keep the funds separate from the main account. Evidence that Renata wasn't just receiving money, she was actively helping to hide it. Crane objected multiple times. He argued that Renata had been manipulated by a controlling partner, that she'd trusted Brian's explanations without understanding the full picture, that she was a victim of his deception, not a participant in it. Diane was ready for every objection. She pointed out that Renata had never questioned the source of funds that paid for a luxury apartment, international travel, and a lifestyle far beyond what a freelance interior designer could afford. She'd never asked why Brian wanted the money kept separate. She'd never wondered why her boyfriend's wife was listed on none of the accounts. Renata had accepted everything Brian gave her without scrutiny because scrutiny might have ended the arrangement. That wasn't ignorance. That was willful blindness. Diane called Neil Ashford to the stand. He testified about the internal investigation, the sophistication of Brian's scheme, the way he'd exploited the company's trust for years. He described Brian as calculating, methodical, and completely without remorse. He told the court that Brian had shown no signs of guilt, even when the investigation closed in. Only concern about being caught. Then Diane called me. I'd prepared for this moment, practiced my statement with Diane a dozen times. But sitting in that witness chair, looking out at the courtroom, I felt the weight of everything I'd lost pressing down on me. I told the judge about my marriage, 7 years of what I thought was partnership, the plans we'd made, the children we'd postponed because Brian said we needed to be financially stable first. I described finding the documents in his office after his death, the apartment deed, the bank statements, the insurance policy that cut me out completely. I told the court about going to Hoboken, about knocking on that door and seeing Renata holding a baby with my husband's face. My voice cracked when I talked about the dimple. Brian's dimple, the one I used to trace with my finger when he smiled at me. I told the judge that Brian had built an entire life without me. A family, a future. He'd planned for his death to leave me with nothing while Renata received everything. I'd been his cover story for 7 years, the respectable wife who made him look trustworthy while he stole from everyone around him. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. Crane didn't cross-examine me. There was nothing he could ask that wouldn't make Renata look worse. The judge reviewed the evidence for a long moment. Then he delivered his ruling. He found that Renata had knowingly received and concealed assets derived from fraud. He ordered the immediate liquidation of her investment portfolio and the seizure of the Hoboken apartment. The life insurance payout was blocked permanently. All recovered funds would be divided between me and Brian's former employer. Renata would also face potential criminal charges pending review by the district attorney's office. I watched her face as the judge spoke. The composure she'd maintained all morning finally cracked. Her eyes went wide. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. She looked at Crane like he could fix it, make it go away, restore the life she thought she'd secured. He didn't look back at her. The judge dismissed the court. People began filing out. Diane squeezed my arm and told me we'd won. But I didn't feel like celebrating. I looked across the courtroom one last time. Renata was still sitting at the defendant's table, alone now, staring at the documents in front of her. For 4 years, she'd believed she was the winner, the woman Brian chose, the one he was going to build a life with. Now she knew the truth. Brian hadn't chosen her. He'd used her, the same way he'd used me. And in the end, he'd been planning to leave us both behind. 6 months after the trial, I moved into an apartment on the Upper East Side. 12th floor, big windows, morning light that filled every room. It was smaller than the house in Westchester, but it was mine. No memories of Brian in the walls, no ghosts in the hallways, just empty space waiting to become something new. The financial recovery took time, but Diane was relentless. The Hoboken apartment sold at auction for just under $1 million. Renata's investment portfolio was liquidated completely. The Cayman account was seized and divided between me and Brian's former company as part of the settlement. After legal fees, I walked away with enough to start over and to never depend on anyone else's money again. Renata's life unraveled quickly after the ruling. The district attorney's office opened a criminal investigation into her role in concealing stolen assets. She avoided prison by cooperating fully and providing testimony about Brian's methods, but the consequences followed her anyway. Her interior design business collapsed. Clients disappeared. The Instagram account that once showed off her luxury lifestyle went private, then vanished entirely. I heard through Diane that Renata moved back to Pennsylvania to live with her mother. She was raising her daughter alone now, without the apartment, without the investments, without the safety net Brian had promised her. I thought I'd feel satisfaction when I heard that. Justice finally served. But I didn't feel anything. Not because I forgave her. I didn't. She'd known enough to ask questions and chosen not to. She'd built a life on my husband's lies and enjoyed every minute of it. But hating her wasn't going to give me back the 7 years I'd lost. The person I really blamed was already dead. In the weeks after the trial, I started seeing a therapist. Not because anyone told me to, but because I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brian's face, his smile, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I kept searching those memories for cracks, for signs I should have seen. My therapist told me to stop. She said Brian was a skilled manipulator, that he'd fooled his boss, his coworkers, his mistress, and his wife, that there was no way I could have seen through someone who'd spent his whole life learning how to lie. Looking for signs I missed was just another way of blaming myself for his choices. I wasn't responsible for what he did. I was only responsible for what I did next. That conversation changed something in me. I started thinking about all the documents I'd found, the hidden accounts, the falsified invoices, the insurance policy designed to cut me out completely. I'd unraveled Brian's scheme because I was a tax attorney. I knew how to read financial records, trace transfers, spot inconsistencies. Most people didn't have that training. Most women in my situation would have been lost. I thought about how many other wives were out there, living inside marriages they didn't understand, trusting husbands who were hiding money, moving assets, planning exits, women who would find out the truth only when it was too late, after a divorce, after a death, after everything had already been taken. I could help them. I talked to Diane about it. She'd been thinking the same thing. She'd handled dozens of cases like mine over the years, and they all had the same pattern. Women who trusted too much, men who planned too well. A legal system that moved too slowly to protect the victims until the damage was already done. We decided to build something together. I left my old firm and opened a new practice with Diane as a partner. We specialized in marital fraud, hidden assets, secret accounts, financial abuse disguised as love. Our clients were women who discovered their husbands had been lying about money for years, women who needed someone to believe them and fight for them. The first client walked through our door 3 weeks after we opened. She was shaking. She'd found a bank statement she didn't recognize and didn't know what to do. Her husband had told her it was nothing, a mistake, an old account he'd forgotten to close. She didn't believe him. I told her she was right not to. That was a year ago. Now, we have a waiting list. I still think about Brian sometimes. Not with love, not even with anger anymore. Just with a kind of distant clarity, like I'm looking at a photograph of someone I used to know. I think about the man I thought he was, and the man he actually was, and how completely different those two people turned out to be. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust someone again. That's the wound he left, the one that goes deeper than the money or the lies. The knowledge that you can share a bed with someone for 7 years and never really know them at all. But I'm not the woman I was when he died. That woman believed love meant trusting without question, That loyalty meant never looking too closely, that a good wife didn't ask where the money came from. I know better now. I know that trust has to be earned and verified and earned again. I know that love without honesty isn't love at all. And I know that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves because we're afraid of what the truth might cost us. Brian thought he'd gotten away with everything. He thought his secrets would stay buried with him, that I'd never find the documents, never trace the money, never learn the truth. He underestimated me. They always do. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I know this story was heavy. I know it was long, but I needed to tell it, and I'm glad you were here to hear it. If you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who might be living inside a lie without realizing it, share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is show them they're not alone. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Before you go, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Take care of yourself. And trust your instincts. They're usually right.